Today I'll be discussing the implications of and necessity for including Indigenous wisdom into current Western climate discourse by diving in a little deeper into the colonial underpinnings of capitalist thought and its ineffectiveness and inability in transforming systems that create current climate crises that our global community is facing. Since the beginning of the colonial period, specifically in the 15th through 17th centuries of Western society, all of Western civilization has been based fundamentally on the erasure of indigenous peoples through genocide and massacre and ideological suppression and cultural suppression. For this reason, it's imperative for Westerners, especially, to understand the categories that construct our worldviews socially and ideologically, and to critically evaluate the colonial and exploitative underpinnings of current systems such as, and specifically, neoliberal capitalism. Such conceptual categories that underpin and continue to shape Western systems of thought include the fundamental disengagement of humans from their natural environments, the individualistic tendencies that extrapolate and alienate humans from their social environments, and hierarchical binaries emergent from classical logic. It's no coincidence that the Enlightenment project emerged from this time period of coloniality based on its ideas of exploitation and hierarchy and individualism. It's clear that there are some connections historically and ideologically between the colonial period and the Enlightenment project in terms of individuality, classical logic, and disengagement. Even further, systems of capitalism as a social and economic and political structure fundamentally depend on and instantiate these conceptual categories that were created in the Enlightenment, again, which are tied to coloniality and the erasure of indigenous knowledge, that allow for transactional and instrumental social and ecological relations. For example, instrumental rationality is a central tenet and driving force of both Enlightenment philosophy and Western modern thought, and capitalism and its socioeconomic structures, as the natural environment and other people begin to be viewed as instrumental and transactional beings that we are alienated from as individuals. These understandings of nature and culture have created and continue to exacerbate systems of ecological destruction and resource exploitation, and of the colonization and forced removal of Native peoples from their native ancestral lands. The Western capitalist ideologies that are responsible for this large scale degradation of natural and social resources has proven itself to have fundamentally flawed assumptions, such as supply demand mechanisms, cost benefit analyses, and understandings of externalities, which have created unsustainable social and economic systems in the West. Today, more than ever, through increasingly intense and destructive climate crises and global public health pandemics, for example, people in the West, and specifically in the capitalist West, are beginning to see the fundamental flaws and cracks in the ideological and material systems which we have taken for granted since the colonial period. Based on the aforementioned theoretical concepts of individuality, exploitation, and coloniality, market-based approaches to climate change, such as carbon taxes, have proven inefficient and incapable of correcting and mitigating those systems of exploitation that categorically depend on such assumptions. Since these assumptions and systems are foundationally built upon the control and subjugation of indigenous peoples, and have also proven to be inadequate at addressing the problems that are facing our global community today, I implore readers and listeners to look to spaces of indigenous knowledge for answers to questions we have not learned yet to ask. The necessity for including indigenous wisdom in Western climate discourse is not only ideological or historical. Because of its spiritual and ancestral connections to the land and conceptual understandings of humans and nature as inextricably united by imbued energy, Indigenous communities disproportionately experience the climate crisis. Even though the world's first climate technologies were created by Indigenous peoples, systems of the West and modern Western thought perpetuate this idea of the ecological other, or of an ecological Indian, that has and continues to delegitimize the Indigenous way of life and perpetuate systems of climate change. Ingrained within Indigenous knowledge is an understanding of the natural and cultural world that humans find themselves in, is intimately defined by an ecosystem of human and non human actors, implicitly imbued with a spirit, with an energy, in which they relate and commune with one another. Since the hierarchical and categorical binaries of the Enlightenment project and of Western capitalism don't exist in Indigenous thought, humans and nature are fundamentally understood as one ecosystem, and therefore climate change not only disproportionately impacts Indigenous people, but their wisdom can disproportionately transform the systems that create climate change. Therefore, Western climate discourse must begin to engage with Indigenous resistance movements, legitimating and including Indigenous wisdom into current policy. There are examples of this cross ontological commitment, especially through Bolivia's Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth and Indigenous cooperatives in South America, but there's a lot of work still yet to be done. Western capitalist states like the United States continue to fail to include and understand Indigenous wisdom in climate policy, fundamentally because of the categories which the Enlightenment and colonialism have put into capitalism systems that otherize and attribute falsity to non Western ways of knowing. Policymakers, community organizers, activists, and scholars must begin to realize the necessity of decolonizing current frameworks of thought that the West has maintained through generations in order to include and legitimize Indigenous people in state policy and representation in climate change. As the world seems to unravel into uncertainty through public health crises and ecological crises, I urge listeners to think about the moral, ecological, and social obligations that we have to engage with alternate knowledges and frameworks in order to more holistically guide transformative action.